first saw that term, Eschew Obfuscation, on a bumper sticker years ago, I knew it was a title looking for a sermon. And I discovered, as I looked it up, and there was actually a second part, as you can see, espouse elucidation. So, eschew obfuscation, espouse elucidation.
Wow.
Avoid ambiguity, adopt clarity. And so it is my aspiration that this elucidation of this idiosyncratic nature of this aforementioned ironical phraseology fulfills the anticipatory feelings of this morning's assemblage.
Well said.
Hear, hear.
Oh, I had to write it with the thesaurus. Steven Pinker, in his book, The Stuff of Thought, Language as a Window into Human Nature. He included in that book this Calvin and Hobbes comic strip to exemplify a point about language. I'll go ahead and read it. I'm not sure everybody can read it. So Calvin's sitting at a school desk holding a paper, and his expression is clearly one of panic. On the paper it reads, "Explain Newton's first law of motion in your own words." Then the thought comes, and Calvin writes his answers. Yaka, fu, mog, grog, papa whoop, zinc, watum, gazork, tumbles bugs. Finally he says, "I love loopholes." Of course, the point that Pinker is making was that language, words, grammar, syntax, it's all community property. While it could be argued that every word had to first be invented, likely maybe by an individual, it's meaningless unless there is some common understanding of what that word means. This is made all the more difficult by the fact that all words are nothing more than metaphors, symbols that stand in for the real things. So when we talk about tree, we can point and say tree. It's just in our language, it's just this, a sound. It's just words, sounds that we make in a certain order, and we say tree, and we point. This, and this, and this, and this, and even this. Defining a physical object like a tree is rather simple. Even though they look very different, we kind of get the image. We have a brain that's capable of understanding these broader concepts, and then we can break it down into specific types of trees. Verbs, though, they're a little bit harder, aren't they? Running. Got to get that point across. Because I might just be thinking, somebody looking stupid, right? Could mean a number of things. It takes time to get verbs across. However, defining words that stand for abstract ideas, things we can't point to, those things we can't measure, those ineffable. Love. How do you describe love? And then there's those religiously charged words. Liberal, conservative, religious, spiritual, God. How do you define these words? And that's made all the more difficult by the fact that these words have different meanings at different times, and even in different churches. When we say God, we might have this one concept, if we even say it at all. But then, you go to any church, you go to any synagogue, you go to anywhere, and when they use God, it all means something different to each one of them. They're not only different, they're conflicting often. Ours is a judging God, ours is a loving God. And then they all look different too. Now, I've read any number of books on theology. I've asked any number of people how they define God, and have yet to hear the same words used in exactly the same way. unless they happen to be reciting a creed or intentionally quoting another person's words because they like the way they sound. But when you dig a little deeper, you find, well, I like this, but, and they always change their definitions just a bit. There was one definition of God that I have heard that I generally accept, and that is the word used by many to describe matters of ultimate concern. In other words, God is not something to believe in or not believe. It's a word. God is a word we use or we don't use, determined by our own experience and understanding of the world. I like the definition because it purposely does not attempt to define those matters of ultimate concern which tend to be highly individualized. And this definition allows everyone to have different opinions, different ideas about God, while not limiting that what God can be for someone else. When we attempt to define the ineffable, when we try to put personal experience in a box, we make a potentially dangerous mistake. We are assuming that our experience is the same for all people in all time. What God is or isn't is a matter of personal experience. Experience of that which moves us to a renewal and an openness to life and love. The first, and I would argue the primary source of our religious tradition. Communication, of course, is not just the words we use. It includes often more subtle forms of communication like tone of voice, body language, context. Let's consider the following story. It was during the final days of Denver's Stapleton Airport, which was closed in the mid-90s. So a crowded flight was canceled and a single agent was rebooking a long line of inconvenienced travelers. And suddenly an angry passenger pushes his way to the desk and slapped his ticket down on the counter saying, "I have to be on that flight and it has to be first class." The agent replied, "I'm sorry, sir. I'll be happy to help you, but I've got to help these folks first and I'm sure we'll be able to work something out." Unimpressed, the passenger asked loudly so that everyone around could hear, "Do you have any idea who I am?" And without hesitating, the gate agent smiled, grabbed her public address microphone. "May I have your attention, please? We have a passenger here at the gate who doesn't know who he is. If anyone can help him find his identity, please come to the gate." It's not just what we say. It's how we say it. The story is funny because it was an intentional misinterpretation. But people very often do get as much or more from how we say things than what we say. If we are speaking about something we claim to be important to us, and our tone is dry and implacable, exactly what message are we sending? I think there is one particular way we, as Unitarian Universalists, can eschew obfuscation and espouse elucidation that could be very useful. How many here have experienced the difficulty of explaining Unitarian Universalism to someone who has never heard of us before? Huh? How many? It's a hard one, huh? It often happens around here that someone asks, "Where do you go to church?" First, the assumption is that you go to church, right?
Right.
And what is the first thing that someone will say when you tell them you attend the Unitarian Universalist congregation or church or fellowship or whatever? What do they ask?
What's
What-
that?
Where
Where?
Where is the first place? And then
After they ask where, they ask what. What do you believe? What do they believe? Which we answer with a few ums. It's complicated. Followed by some more ums and perhaps a very complex answer explaining how we are Buddhists, atheists, pagans, and Christians all worshiping together under the banner of love and acceptance. Or we provide some complicated, confusing explanation of Unitarian Universalist polity, theology, history. They were the Unitarians, and these were the Universalists, and they believed, and they came. All of which is not incorrect. But what are we communicating?
confusion, yes.
Obfuscation.
And to most people, you might as well be saying Yakufu, Mag, Grug, Pabuwagzik, Watumgazork, Tumble Spreads. Because their idea of church is one thing. What if instead of using our heads to answer the question, which is where those complex and clever answers come from, even those ones that we have, we've spent a lot of time creating, okay, this is what Unitarian Universalism is, and we've spent a lot of time and we've memorized it, and then we spout it, and people still go, huh? So instead of these very clever answers, what if instead we used our hearts? What if we changed the terms of the conversation? Which brings us to another Calvin and Hobbes. So Calvin is again looking at a test, and the paper says, what important event took place on December 16, 1773? Calvin begins to write, I do not believe in linear time. There is no past and future. All is one, and existence in the temporal sense is illusory. This question, herefore, is meaningless and impossible to answer. And then he looks at us and says, when in doubt, deny all terms and definitions. So what if, when people ask, what do Unitarian Universalists believe? What if instead we change the terms and definitions and we simply state the reasons we belong? So when somebody asks, what do Unitarian Universalists believe? A question based on their experience, their understanding of church, one in which belief is paramount. Eschew obfuscation, espouse elucidation, and tell them Unitarian Universalists, don't necessarily share a common belief. But I go there because it's where my personal beliefs are accepted and honored. It's where I feel nurtured and loved. I go there because we stand on the side of love. Of course, give them an appropriate answer for yourself. I don't mean to put words in your mouth. Those are the reasons I come. I believe when we cease looking for ways to differentiate ourselves from other churches and instead focus on what makes this church special to us, when we cease to muddy the waters of communication with heady interpretations of who we are and what we do, and then speak directly to the heart of the reason we come here, we may find in return that there are many people looking for those very same things. We may find that though our beliefs and practices may be different, the real reason we attend is universal. I'm guessing our reasons for attending this church, this congregation, are not all that different than why most people attend their own spiritual home. This is where we feel connected. We feel respected. Where we feel empowered to live our faith. According to the Pew Research Center, 23% of the public tell us that they are religiously unaffiliated, that they are atheist or agnostic, or that their religion is just nothing in particular. We often call this group religious nuns, that's N-O-N-E-S, because they tell us they have no religious affiliation. I read that. I started thinking, well, that 23% of the population, they sure sound a lot like us. And that doesn't even include all the people who identify as pagan or Buddhist or Christian or whatever in search of a diverse and loving community in which to share and grow, because many of them don't feel comfortable in their churches or their religious communities because of their diverse beliefs, or there is nothing around them that they can go to and belong to. So let's raise it to 25%, 1/4 of the population are a lot like us. I bet that's more than you imagine. I believe our religious movement has barely scratched the surface of potential membership, of potential reach into the community. We can change that. The first step towards greater inclusion is how we choose to talk about ourselves. And why are we here? What does this church, this community, offer that you cannot receive anywhere else, that gets you here on Sunday mornings? Aren't most people looking for that same thing? This isn't to say Unitarian Universalism is a good fit for everyone. Only that there are far more people out there looking for what we found than we may have imagined. And we will see the truth in that when we do eschew obfuscation, espouse elucidation, avoid ambiguity, and adopt clarity about our chosen faith. Most of what keeps human beings divided, where we seem to be most different, is actually quite shallow. What differentiates us is largely culturally based: language, religion, customs, attitudes. Where we are most alike is deeper. When we connect with another person at the heart level, we bypass the cultural defenses and speak directly to the person. I remember, well, it was 17 years ago yesterday, after my father died. An older gentleman who I knew was religiously conservative. He was a friend of my father's, and I had seen him many times. My father was a savings and loan manager, and he was a customer and a friend, and they did many things together. So I met this man over time, never really felt drawn to him. But I remember at my father's memorial service, he came up to me, and he remembered me as well. And I was expecting, my dad had told me he's very religiously conservative, very involved in his church, all those things. So I was expecting some just, wrote religious statement, he's with God now, something that just would have been meaningless to me. But he didn't say anything. He just looked in my eyes. And I felt his compassion. And no other words were ever said. He gave me a hug, patted me on the back, and walked away. I do not remember what anybody else said to me that day. Nothing. But I remember that look in his eyes, that connection, that so human connection. I know we were divided in so many ways, by age, by culture, by religion. But in our sorrow, we were brought together. There's a lot of lonely, searching people in our community, in our world. They're looking for us. If we make that connection, without the fancy words, and with that heartfelt connection, we may be able to get through the barriers that divide us, that separate us. And we may find we're not as different as we like to think. So be it. Amen.